Hi, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you for
Can you introduce yourself a little bit?
my name is Mackensie Minniear. I am now an assistant professor at the University of Georgia. I just finished up my doctorate at the University of Nebraska. And I study basically families that haven't been studied very often or historically kind of disenfranchised families. So lately that means I look at the role of ethnicity and race in our families and how we can talk about that in a way that empowers people to live a healthier, more fulfilling life, and kind of just, well, how we come to know what ethnicity and race means in our family and all the processes that go into that.
So can you tell me a little bit more about why you chose that and maybe a little bit about your own background?
Yeah, so I started like my research for, a lot of different reasons. But I come from a mixed household. My mother's Black and my dad is white. So there were always things I noticed about my family that weren't always featured in other families, right? So, first of all, I knew that I was lighter skinned than my cousins, and that kind of played out differently for me versus my brother. We spent a lot of time in our house talking about Martin Luther King and civil rights and the Civil War and about it being about slavery, not states' rights, and all of those kinds of conversations that it didn't seem like my peers were having. So I was always very much surrounded by books, TVs, and movies that kind of represented this really racially diverse world. And it didn't seem like my peers had that same kind of upbringing overall. Right? So they always kind of talked about racial differences, but when it came up in classes, we didn't really talk about it. So, growing up, I went to public schools, but I don't think we rarely read, if ever, stories, by Asian American or African American or Latinx authors. We were kind of few and far between where I read a few, but they were definitely centered much more on kind of European perspective. We had European history. We didn't really have African history. So that always kind of like was in the back of my mind about how we learn about those things. And that kind of came to a forefront in college when you get to see a lot of different people and how they're raised and what kinds of questions they get to ask too. So I just started, asking questions, reading a lot of books, looking into these. And I ended up really liking to ask questions and to get to know these kinds of things. So I ended up getting a doctorate in it. And now that I'm a professor, I can ask those questions for the rest of my life.
That's awesome. That's really awesome. So I'm really glad that you're here sharing with us tonight. And so you're going to talk to us about, oh, I already forgot. Identifying racial. Go ahead. Just go with it.
It's funny. My partner does the same thing where I've told them what I like the name of my dissertation. They're like, it's too long. We can't do it. So I study ethnic racial socialization, which is it's just a fancy way of saying how people learn what race and ethnicity means. And that's all it is. And that involves both implicitly learning and explicitly. So it's not just sitting down and having a conversation with your parents or with your children or with your cousins. It's also like what you surround yourself with and all of those kinds of things. So I can say like there's a lot of differences in how kids and children start to perceive ethnicity and race throughout their lives, right? And I think there's this idea that sometimes children are too young to talk about it, right? But it's as early as about 3 years old, children can start understanding and noticing those physical differences. So between 3 and 6 is usually when children are actually able to start noticing differences, right? They can see that certain groups are being avoided. They can actually start picking up these kinds of implicit racial biases. So they can see like certain groups of people we don't go by, certain groups of people we do, and they can actually start showing kind of stereotypes and prejudice as early as 3 to 6. Now that doesn't mean every single child will grow up prejudiced. That's also a time where you can start showing your children, it doesn't really matter, kind of incorporating those things, but children do notice those differences kind of between 3 and 6. And usually around 6 to 10 is really when children start to get to those non-observable things about ethnicity and race. It's not just someone has a different skin color, but they start to notice things like cultures and costumes and food and language. So it's still kind of abstract for them, but they can start talking about this is what my family does that's different. So usually around 6 to 10 is this really great time in life to start taking your kids to different festivals, talking more about history, just surrounding them with more books and movies and TVs to kind of get that broader views.
Can I ask you a question real quick? So I do that now with my soon-to-be 3-year-old. Do you think that that's beneficial, or is that just more beneficial for like the parent?
I think it's beneficial for both. I think as soon as you can start making it a normal thing.
Okay.
Right. And that's the big thing, is you just want to normalize the idea that sometimes people look different. And that is a thing, right? You don't have to sit down your 2-year-old and talk to them about institutionalized racism yet. But as long as you start doing that and it becomes like an ingrained normal part of your family, it's not something you have to think about later on.
Okay.
Right. And again, if he's 2, in a couple of years, he'll start understanding those differences. Right. He'll start picking up on those things.
Okay.
So then usually around 10 to 14 is kind of this really salient age for children when, things really come to light for them. And that's usually when parents start to get the most uncomfortable talking about ethnicity and race, right? So this 10 to 14 is kind of the first time children are most likely to actually experience discrimination and experience racism and kind of that interpersonal interaction. So it's a really important time. And again, there's these 2 scholars, Drs. Daniel and Daniel, who compare, especially raising Black children, to kind of the hot stove. So you can prepare your child for what it will feel like to touch a hot stove, but to learn the danger, they have to experience it. So, and that's kind of an unfortunate reality, but all those things you do before that moment where they are encountered with it, right? So like giving them positive representation, giving them positive role models, surrounding them, making it something of habit, it won't stop them from experiencing it, but can definitely act as a buffer.
Okay.
And then kind of around adolescence, so we say 14 to 18 is kind of when you really get children who develop that ethnic group consciousness and ethnic identity, right? Some say this is the pinnacle age of identity development, which makes sense because I remember being 15 and just being very moody and emotional, and everything was catastrophic, and I had to figure out my identity, which I think we've all been through that phase. Mm-hmm. But this is kind of a really good time where they're going to be really aware of these things. They can really start labeling it. They're kind of still have more of a fully developed prefrontal cortex. They can kind of understand these things more. So the idea is you want to find ways to talk about it throughout their entire lifespan, right? You don't want to make it a conversation where they're afraid to talk about it, right? And this is absolutely true with white children as well, right? No matter what, you want this to be something. I've had a lot of parents who are struggling on how to talk to their children right now after this summer of unrest. And they want to talk to their kids about it. And it's how do we incorporate those things throughout their lifespan and make those important. So that's kind of a raw and dirty overview of ethnic racial socialization, kind of those different stages. But it is too, it's a lifelong process, right? You're not just teaching your children teach you too. You don't just reach 18 and you're boom, have your identity figured out. It's a process, and you're constantly socializing and learning these things throughout your life.
Right. That's awesome. I'm so glad that you shared. I know I've heard it before, and being able to kind of understand what your child might understand is really helpful. Mm-hmm. I do have a question. So you were talking about like adolescence and when you're trying to, figure out who you are and whatnot. So as somebody who is biracial, since biracial, is not a race, like how did you identify yourself, or how do you identify, or how do you choose? Because I was thinking about this myself, like what is my son going to choose? Because he's pretty light-skinned, but he's Black and he's white. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. The short answer is complicated. And it's always kind of a hard conversation, and it almost changes throughout your life a little bit. A lot of it depends on just your features almost. So I think I tend to identify more as Black, and that's not just because it's a personal choice. It's also the choice ascribed to me by others.
Yeah.
Right. So if I went up to someone and said I'm white, people wouldn't believe me.
Right.
Right. And that won't stop certain people from treating me certain ways because I identify that way. So it becomes a balance almost, right? And I think there's a pressure, especially among multiracial people, to have to pick a race and stick with it. And I think race is a lot more fluid than that, and our understandings change a lot more than that. And it's something you kind of ask yourself throughout your life. So I, right now, identify as Black, and that's partially because if we look at race as also more phenotypical, that like I look Black.
Okay.
I look at least Blacker than I do white.
Yeah.
Although a lot of people just think I'm Hispanic, so that's always fun.
Right.
But, right, so I identify more that way because it's also what's described to me, what I'm comfortable with, how my lived experience goes. Right, and that's not to say I love my dad dearly. I love our Irish heritage. I love what we've learned that way, but my experience of existing in the world isn't as a white person.
Right.
If that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for answering that as well. Is there anything else that you want to say?
Sure. I have a couple things I can talk about.
Okay.
So I think a big part of when we talk about learning about ethnicity and race is just, especially if we're giving advice to parents, family members, anyone, a big thing is just learn to be comfortable with uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be fluid, it's going to change a lot, and we've definitely been conditioned and socialized throughout our lives to not talk about race and not bring it up, and that is rude. And part of answering these bigger questions we're facing right now is to be comfortable being uncomfortable, is to being comfortable having people push back on those kinds of things and really think about it. And the second, like the other big thing is showing, not just telling, right? And I think we focus a lot on explicit messages, like I need to sit down and tell my child that like they should be proud and all that stuff. But it's just as simple as like, you know, if your child if your child is Black, surround them by Black artists too. Like have Black art and Black books and those kinds of things. And on top of that, don't just relegate it to what their ethnic racial identity is. You can expand that too, right? You shouldn't just have those kinds of books. You can have lots of different books featuring like a more global library and perspective overall. So it doesn't have to be you have to sit them down every 2 days and have a big conversation. There's very implicit ways where you can change their surroundings, and that will foster like communication, and that will foster a different way of thinking as well.
Awesome. Awesome. That's good tips. Okay. Well, I appreciate your time. Do you have a link or anything to your thesis or?
It's available online. It's real long, so
Okay.
I don't know if anyone wants to read it.
That's okay. I would like to maybe like put a link on this in our YouTube just to
Yeah,
have,
definitely.
but because you put all the work into it, we might as well get the resource out.
Okay.
And maybe hopefully we'll be able to connect again on any other topic that you come up with.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, perfect.